I never want to do it again. It was the hardest time in my whole life. That was one of the worst transitions I've ever had.
What happens when power, fame, and silence collide over and over for decades? The music industry has long buried its darkest truths under platinum records and whispered settlements. Efforts to expose abuse often crumble under legal threats or public denial, leaving survivors voiceless. But now, at 85, one woman is doing what no lawsuit, documentary, or movement could. Candi Staton, once a disco queen, now a gospel matriarch, has broken her silence. And with it, she's unraveling a hidden history of predators, protected icons, and careers built on fear. This isn't just a revelation, it's a reckoning. Fade in on a black and white photo. A teenage girl, smiling brightly, clutches a microphone like a lifeline. That girl was Candi Staton. Born in 1940, raised deep in the segregated South, she came into the world with a voice that could shatter walls. And maybe, she hoped, build new ones too. By the time she was in her teens, she'd already toured with the Soul Stirrers and Mahalia Jackson. But gospel music, no matter how heavenly, couldn't pay the bills. It couldn't keep the hunger out of her stomach or the bruises off her mother's skin. So when the offers came, offers soaked in liquor, laced with opportunity, whispered in smoky back rooms, she took them. The gospel girl moved to Muscle Shoals. That's where the devils lived. At Fame Studios in Alabama, Candi Staton wasn't a child of God anymore. She was a product, packaged, sold, and surrounded by men who saw women as commodities and contracts as cages. She recorded Stand By Your Man, Young Hearts Run Free, and I'm Just a Prisoner. The irony of that last title wouldn't be lost on her, because that's exactly what she became. The men in the control rooms weren't just engineers and producers. They were kings in kingdoms without laws. Some were married, some were high. All of them were untouchable. And Candi, young, beautiful, hungry, was just another voice they could manipulate. She never said their names back then. She smiled, signed the deals, and sang like her life depended on it. Because sometimes it did. Behind the gold records were hotel rooms she couldn't leave without an escort. Behind the awards were threats whispered between sessions. Be good, they'd say. Be smart. And she was. She was both. And still, it wasn't enough. In a world where women's voices sold millions but their pain sold nothing, silence was the currency. Candi traded in it for decades. But now, at 85, she's not cashing in anymore. She's cashing out. And she's ready to name names. The 1970s were dripping with glamour and rot. Disco balls spun above powder-dusted mirrors, reflecting back a world high on fantasy and deaf to suffering. Soul, funk, and R&B ruled the charts with velvet gloves. But what listeners didn't hear were the screams buried beneath the bass lines. Behind every lush orchestration, there were studios where power went unchecked, and promises came with invisible chains. Candi Staton was everywhere during this era. Her voice, piercing, emotional, unmistakably human, was the sound of yearning itself. She could pull tears from steel and strength from silence. To the world, she seemed untouchable, a queen among gods. But what no one saw was the torment underneath the glitter. She wasn't rising in the industry. She was being pulled under. The deals she made weren't only with record labels. They were with men who demanded submission before offering opportunity. Men who used access as leverage, offering hit singles and prime tour slots in exchange for one thing: silence. If she played along, the studio time appeared. If she didn't, the doors closed. Quietly, efficiently, without a trace. One missed call, one canceled session, one faded dream. Candi once described the studio air as a mix of whiskey and fear. Not metaphorically, literally. She would walk into sessions where the floor was sticky with old liquor and the walls echoed with threats disguised as flirtation. Everyone knew the rules: speak too loudly, and you'd never be heard again. She still remembers one night in Memphis. A legendary funk artist, still alive, still honored in retrospectives and documentaries, locked the studio door behind her and said, "Tonight, you're mine." He wasn't referring to the music. The engineer on duty looked away. The security guard wouldn't meet her eyes as she stumbled out into the humid southern night. She told no one. Because the last girl who did? She disappeared, dropped from her label, removed from credits, rumored to have gone mad. No one asked questions. No one dared. Then there was the other one, a slick-haired, high-profile producer beloved by critics, now immortalized in halls of fame. He courted Candi with talk of reinvention, of a new sound that would cement her place in music history. The price? A night in his hotel suite. "Let's get to know each other," he said. When she refused, the track vanished. Years later, he told Rolling Stone it was due to creative differences. Candi laughs bitterly when she hears that now, because she never needed to make a deal with the devil. The devil had already built a corner office at the label. He wore Grammy pins and used gospel metaphors to explain his process. He signed checks and ruined lives with the same hand. And still, she sang. Because the only thing more dangerous than staying was leaving. Success is supposed to shield you. It's supposed to lift you above the chaos, give you protection, power, peace. But for Candi Staton, every chart-topping hit, every gold record, every glowing headline only painted a bigger target on her back. The more famous she became, the more control she lost. Her name was a brand, her voice a commodity, and her body negotiable. In the studio, her voice was unmatched, haunting, raw, divine. It could sell records by the millions, stir souls, and turn ordinary lyrics into gospel. But outside those walls, her voice didn't matter. When she cried out about the bruises, the threats, the manipulation, first by her husband, then by the men who managed her, booked her, signed her, she wasn't met with concern. She was met with nods, contracts, and silence. "We'll take care of it," they'd say. And they did, by erasing the evidence and reminding her who paid her bills. She was married 6 times. Some of those unions were brief. Some were brutal. One in particular she rarely spoke of until recently. He was a fellow musician, respected, still celebrated. A man whose records sit in collections across the country, played at cookouts, and covered by new artists. But to Candi, he was something else, a tyrant with a temper. He hit her during rehearsals, not once, not in a moment of rage, repeatedly, systematically. To correct her pitch, he claimed. When she questioned tour finances, he locked her in a hotel room for 48 hours with no food. When she escaped, emaciated and shaken, she was warned, not by him, but by others in the industry. "Don't make trouble. Don't ruin his name. You don't want to be one of those women." So she wasn't. She showed up on Soul Train with broken ribs hidden beneath sequined gowns. She posed for album covers while medicated, bruises carefully concealed with makeup. She smiled, danced, and sang like her life depended on it, because it did. Speaking out could mean blacklisting. Speaking out could mean disappearing. To the world, she was radiant, a disco diva, a gospel powerhouse, a survivor. But privately, she carried a secret, one so heavy it nearly pulled her under. She tried to drown it in music. It didn't work. She tried therapy, pills, silence. But in the end, what saved her wasn't the industry. It wasn't justice. It was something older. something she'd once fled from in search of fame: gospel. She returned to the church not to salvage her image, but to salvage herself. There, she found sanctuary, but not perfection. Even behind the pulpit, predators prowled, men cloaked in scripture who wielded shame like a weapon. "The devil doesn't always come in a nightclub," she once said. "Sometimes he comes in a three-piece suit, holding a Bible." And still, she stayed. Not because it was safe, but because it was hers. For the first time in a long time, she belonged to her. By the 1980s, Candi Staton had houses in Atlanta, royalty checks from disco hits, and a name that echoed from nightclubs to church choirs. But wealth doesn't always buy freedom. Sometimes it builds higher walls. In one sprawling estate outside of Nashville, she says the rooms were wired with intercoms, not for music, but for surveillance. Her husband at the time, another musician turned manager, installed them after accusing her of being too friendly with collaborators. She remembers hiding lyrics in dresser drawers, terrified he'd hear her writing about him. "He thought I was his investment," she would later say, not his wife. There were parties, lavish, A-list, candlelit affairs with producers, pastors, and politicians. But Candi learned to recognize the masks. The man shaking hands with gospel singers during the day might be the same one forcing himself on a backup singer that night. The woman praising Jesus on Sunday might be threatening to blacklist another artist on Monday. At one party, a well-known label executive, now dead, but honored with a star on the Music City Walk of Fame, dragged a teenage girl into the pool house. The girl came out disheveled. No one said a word. Candi tried to intervene once, just once. She warned a young artist not to get in a limo with a certain producer. Days later, that producer pulled Candi's music from rotation at 2 major stations. "Mind your business," he told her, "or I'll end yours." The mansion became a cage, not just of surveillance and fear, but of shame. She had fought so hard to rise up from poverty, only to become complicit in a system of rot. By staying silent, wasn't she protecting them? It took years to realize the answer wasn't silence, it was escape. And when she finally left that house, she left behind more than furniture and gold records. She left behind her name. Because the name Candi Staton was no longer hers. It belonged to them. There's a term insiders used: half joke, half truth, studio gods. These were the producers, arrangers, and session leaders who didn't just create music. They dictated destinies. Candi Staton knew them all. Some were brilliant, even visionary, but many were drunk on power, enabled by an industry that worshipped results and ignored damage. They built myths around themselves: genius eccentrics, tortured artists, misunderstood kings of the console. But behind those myths were contracts signed under duress, sessions that turned predatory, and careers destroyed when a woman said no. One producer, who shaped the sound of modern R&B and won multiple Grammys, once made her record an entire album barefoot in a freezing studio. "Keeps the tension in your voice," he told her. What it actually did was send her to the hospital with bronchitis. He never visited. Another icon, famed for working with Marvin Gaye and Aretha Franklin, invited her to a writing retreat in Palm Springs. It wasn't a retreat. It was a weekend-long assault. The only thing she walked away with was a song titled "He Called Me Baby." She never told anyone what it really meant. What made it worse was how protected these men were. Lawyers, label heads, even pastors, yes, pastors, would intervene. They'd send flowers, apologize on the producer's behalf. "He's troubled. He didn't mean it. Don't throw your career away over one night." They called it artistry. Candi called it evil. But she still showed up, still sang. Because if she didn't, she'd be labeled difficult. And in the 1970s, a black woman in soul music couldn't afford that label. It was a career death sentence. The cult didn't wear robes. It wore headphones and carried publishing rights. And even now, many of its gods remain untouched, canonized in documentaries, lionized in retrospectives. And the women? Most of them were forgotten. There's a story Candi Staton tells now, slowly, carefully, like each word is a stone being laid on a grave. It's about a man so beloved in the music industry that his funeral was broadcast on television, with tributes from presidents, legends, and icons. A man hailed as a visionary, a mentor, a gatekeeper of black music history. He was the one who crowned careers, handed out awards, and posed with the very artists he'd helped break through. And he once promised to help Candi Staton find her second act. Instead, he nearly ended her. They met at a high-profile industry gala in New York in the late 1980s. Candi was in a stage of reinvention, still revered, but no longer charting. She wore a silver gown and a practiced smile. He approached her like royalty. "You're a queen," he said, and kissed her hand. His voice was syrup-smooth, his reputation impeccable. He spoke of a comeback, a new sound, a fresh angle that could reintroduce her to the world. He invited her to his penthouse suite to talk vision. She hesitated, then brought a friend, just in case. The moment they stepped inside, the tone shifted. The suite was dimly lit, the curtains drawn. Music played faintly in the background. Her friend was led to a separate room to freshen up. The door locked behind them. Candi was alone. He offered her champagne. She declined. That's when the whispering began. "You're not young anymore. Your last single didn't chart. Do you want to be remembered or forgotten?" They weren't questions. They were ultimatums dressed as advice. Veiled threats wrapped in velvet. She remembers those words more vividly than any lyrics she's ever sung. They rang in her ears for years. Because they weren't just cruel. They were true. In an industry obsessed with youth, perfection, and submission, she had become disposable. And he was reminding her of it. She escaped that night. Not by fighting, but by running. Barefoot, trembling, down a long, carpeted hallway. Security guards looked straight ahead as she passed, saying nothing. She called no one, filed no complaint. Because she knew how the industry worked. And in the months that followed, she paid the price. Her phone stopped ringing. Tour dates vanished. Her publicist dropped her without explanation. Her name, once a staple on soul playlists, disappeared. Not loudly, quietly, strategically, efficiently. That's how the music industry punishes women. Not with scandal, with silence. Now, when she sings "Young Hearts Run Free," she sometimes pauses before the final chorus. Her eyes drift upward as if scanning the curtains of memory. What the audience sees as drama is really a reckoning. A silent conversation with the ghosts of a past she was never allowed to share. Because the real cost of surviving wasn't the bruises or the betrayal. It was the pretending. Pretending it never happened. Pretending she was fine. Pretending she owed the world a smile instead of the truth. Now, at 85, she isn't pretending anymore. The stage was her sanctuary. The lights, the crowd, the applause. It was the only place where Candi Staton ever truly felt safe. But just off stage, behind velvet ropes and guarded dressing rooms, was a different reality. One filled with bruises, silence, and betrayal. Touring in the 1970s and 80s wasn't glamorous. Not for her. At least, not behind closed doors. She was often the only woman on the bill, sandwiched between bands with egos as large as their entourages. There were no safe dressing rooms, no HR departments, no one to call when the wrong man walked in. She remembers one night in Detroit. A co-headliner, still praised today as a funk pioneer, cornered her backstage after a show. He slammed her into a wall and whispered filth in her ear, while fans screamed for encores outside. No one intervened. Her manager later told her not to create drama. She had a tour to finish. Another time, in Miami, she overheard a promoter placing bets with his staff about which singer he'd break first. They laughed. Candi locked herself in her dressing room and sang to herself. Gospel hymns, songs from a life that felt like someone else's. There were days she wouldn't eat, nights she couldn't sleep. She traveled with sunglasses not for fashion, but to hide the swelling. Once, on Soul Train, she performed with a broken rib. Don Cornelius never asked why she was moving slower. No one did. The truth is, some bruises don't show up on camera. But the worst abuse wasn't always physical. Sometimes it came in contracts. One producer forced her to sign away publishing rights under threat of shelving her album. Another offered her creative control, then handed final mixes to male executives who butchered her work without her consent. She began to wonder if her voice even belonged to her anymore. Her screams were never heard, but her pain, somehow, made its way into the music. You can hear it in the waver of her voice during "I'm Just a Prisoner," in the near-whispered desperation of "Too Hurt to Cry." And maybe that's why those songs still resonate. Because behind every note was a woman bleeding, beautifully, quietly, and all alone. It didn't happen on a grand stage or in a boardroom. There were no flashing cameras, no microphones, no dramatic goodbyes, just Candi Staton, a battered suitcase, and the faint crackle of a gospel record spinning on an old turntable in the corner of a rented room. The air was still, the silence deafening. She had just returned from another grueling soul tour, one that drained her in ways she could no longer hide. A close friend had overdosed in a hotel bathtub. Another marriage had unraveled behind the scenes, ending not in screams, but in cold avoidance. And somewhere in the chaos, another contract had appeared on her desk. A deal extended without her consent, locking her into more obligations, more performances, more silence. She remembers staring at her own reflection in the mirror of a dimly lit hotel room. The woman who looked back at her didn't seem alive anymore. Her eyes were glassy, her voice hoarse, her soul quiet. She wasn't just tired, she was emptied. That morning, she made a choice. She didn't announce it, she didn't negotiate terms. She simply turned off her phone, canceled her next show, and left Los Angeles. No driver, no entourage, just the road ahead and the hollow thud of her heart with every mile. She drove back to Atlanta in silence. For months, she didn't sing. Not in church, not in studios, not even to herself. She called her mother. "I'm done," she whispered. Her mother didn't ask, "Done with what?" She already knew. Candi had spent years trying to reconcile two worlds, singing about God by day, surviving hell by night. She was told you could balance the sacred and the profane, that you could dance with devils and still find grace. But balance had cost her everything. She didn't want balance anymore. She wanted salvation. So she returned to gospel. Not the polished, commercialized kind wrapped in million-dollar marketing campaigns. Not the kind performed in televised megachurches for screaming crowds. She returned to the gospel of her youth, the one sung in old wooden churches with broken pews and out-of-tune pianos, where nobody asked for autographs, just prayer. She started a ministry, released gospel records under her own name, on her own terms. The music didn't chart. There were no radio deals, but it didn't need to. For the first time, her songs healed her in ways Billboard never could. But healing wasn't forgetting. Even in sacred spaces, she found new devils. Pastors who demanded favors behind closed doors. Church leaders who suggested she water down her testimony so as not to offend influential donors. One man told her, flat out, "You'll scare people if you tell the truth." But this time, Candi didn't comply. She walked away again. No press release, no spectacle. Just a quiet decision. And for the first time in decades, she didn't lose her platform, her career, or her name. She gained something far more precious: herself. There's a reason Candi Staton waited until her 80s to speak. Because the names she's about to reveal were once gods. One, a soul icon with a dozen chart toppers and a Kennedy Center honor. He mentored young women, called them his angels. But Candi says she watched him slip something into a teenage singer's drink backstage. That girl was never seen on that tour again. Another, a pioneering producer known for discovering female talent. He discovered them, yes, but only after destroying their sense of agency. Candi recalls signing a publishing deal with him at 21, only to learn later that the contract gave him ownership of her next 5 albums. When she confronted him, he laughed. "You're lucky I let you sing at all." There was a band leader too, a saxophonist turned solo star. He beat her with a mic stand during a rehearsal because she missed a note. His bandmates stood still, instruments in hand. Later they told her, that's just how he gets. The final name she almost didn't say. A man who called himself a pastor, who wore silk robes and held Sunday services in recording studios. He promised to help her reclaim her spiritual image. Instead, he tried to blackmail her with nude photos taken without her knowledge. Candi held those names in her mouth for half a century. Out of fear, out of shame, out of survival. But now, with a legacy cemented and death no longer a stranger, she speaks. Not for revenge, but for release. Because there are others, still afraid, still silenced, still bleeding in the name of music. And maybe if she says their names, those women will finally believe they're not alone. And maybe, just maybe, those names will lose their power. It's the question no one wants to ask. Because the music still moves you. Even now, when Candi Staton's trembling voice reveals the sins behind the songs, you still catch yourself humming the melodies. Still tap your fingers to those soul-drenched grooves. Still close your eyes and let the rhythm wash over you like it did the first time. But now you know what she endured to bring that music to life. And you can't unknow it. The man who assaulted her also wrote that chart-topping hit you danced to at your wedding. The producer who stole her royalties also crafted that ballad you played on repeat through your first heartbreak. The voice behind her most painful sessions, her abuser, was also the one praised in Rolling Stone's Greatest of All Time. So what now? Do you stop listening? Do you delete the songs? Do you pretend the beauty existed separate from the cruelty? Candi Staton doesn't tell you what to do. She never has. She only tells the truth. And the truth is that she no longer cries when she hears those tracks. She prays. Not for the men who hurt her, but for the girls who came after. The ones who still think fame will protect them. The ones being told, this is just how it works. She sees them in green rooms, on TikTok, on talent shows. Their names may be different. The music may be streamed instead of spun. But the system remains. Slicker, smarter, still dangerous. When asked if she forgives, Candi hesitates. Forgiveness, she says, is for God. But accountability, that's for us. She doesn't seek vengeance. She seeks memory. She wants the world to remember the pain behind the brilliance, the blood behind the beat. Because art is complicated. It always has been. But silence? Silence is deadly. At 85, Candi Staton isn't just reclaiming her story. She's opening the floodgates. And behind her come the voices that were once buried, mocked, erased. You may never hear young hearts run free the same way again. But maybe that's the point. Because loving the music doesn't mean ignoring the scars. It means recognizing them, and finally, truly listening. Not just to the song, but to the woman who sang it. If the truth finally has a voice, will we choose to listen, or keep dancing to songs built on silence? Candi Staton has spoken, but what we do with her story is up to us. Before history repeats itself, speak up while we still can. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.